From the late team here on BBC Two, we'll say goodnight, and for the next hour, we join BBC Parliament.
Order. Urgent question. Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Education to make a statement on the Government's plans to lift the statutory ban on opening new grammar schools in England.
Secretary of State. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As the Prime Minister has said, this government is committed to building a country that works for everyone, not just the privileged few. And we believe that every person should have the opportunity to fulfil their potential, no matter what their background or where they're from. Education is at the heart of this ambition. We inherited a system from the last Labour government, however, where far too many children left school without the qualifications or the skills they needed to be successful in life. And our far-reaching reforms over the last 6 years have changed this. Strengthening school leadership, improving standards of behaviour in our classrooms and ensuring children are taught to read more effectively, improving maths teaching in primary schools. And as a result, there are now 1.4 million more pupils in schools rated as good or outstanding than in 2010. This means more young people are being given the opportunity to access better teaching and to maximise their potential. This is what we want for all children, and where we're continuing our reforms so that every child can have the best possible start in life. It's why we're doubling free childcare to 30 hours for working parents of 3- and 4-year-olds. And as I said in July, on the issue of academic selection, I'm open-minded because we can't rule anything out that could help us grow opportunity for all and give more people the chance to do well in life. The landscape for schools has changed hugely in the last 10, 20, 30 years. We now have a whole variety of educational offers available. There'll be no return to the simplistic binary choice of the past where schools separate children into winners and losers, successes or failures. This government wants to focus on the future, to build on our success since 2010 and to create a truly 21st century school system. But we want a system that can cater for the talent and the abilities of every single child. So to achieve that, we need a truly diverse range of schools and specialisms. We need more good schools in more areas of the country, responding to the needs of every child, regardless of their background. We're looking at a range of options, and I expect any new proposals to focus on what we can do to help everyone to go as far as their own individual talents and capacity for hard work will take them. Education policy to that end will be set in due course.
Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Wow. Despite that waffle, the cat is finally out of the bag. The government has revealed their plans for new grammar schools in England, but not in this House, Mr Speaker. We didn't even hear the word grammar then, but through leaks to the press and at a private meeting of the members opposite. So much for the one nation government that we were promised. So will the Secretary of State promise today that future such announcements will be made here so that we can give the policy the scrutiny it so badly needs? And perhaps she can tell us the evidence base for it today. Has she read the IFS report entry into grammar schools in England? If so, perhaps she remembers the conclusion that among high achievers, those who are eligible for free school meals or live in poorer neighbourhoods are significantly less likely to go to grammar school. The OECD, the Sutton Trust and even the government's own social mobility czar and their chief inspector of schools have all cited the evidence against this policy. And in Kent, where we have grammar schools, the attainment gap is far wider than it is elsewhere. So can she tell the House what evidence she has to support her belief that grammar schools will help disadvantaged children and close the attainment gap? Mr. Speaker, at a time when our schools are facing a crisis in teacher recruitment and retention, with the thousands taught in super-sized classes and schools facing real-term cuts to their budget for the first time in nearly 2 decades, pushing ahead with grammar schools shows a dangerous misunderstanding of the real issues facing our schools. And can the Secretary of State tell us what she will be doing to address the real problems that are facing our schools today? The Prime Minister has said this policy is justified because we already have social selection. Quite how making things worse by bringing back grammar schools as a solution remains a mystery. Perhaps the Secretary of State can tell us why she's ensuring that all children don't get a decent education. This policy will not help social mobility, Mr. Speaker, but will entrench inequality and disadvantage. It will be the lucky few who can afford the tuition who will get ahead, and the disadvantage that will be left behind. A policy for the few at the expense of the many. Mr. Speaker, I was told that the Tories know the cost of everything and the value of nothing. I don't even think they know that anymore. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister promised to lead a one-nation government. She said her policy would be led by the evidence, and she claimed that she would govern for the disadvantaged and not the privileged few. Yet this policy fails on every single count. It may be a new Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, but the same old nasty Tories.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I suppose the first thing I would say to the Honourable Lady is we haven't actually made any policy announcements yet. They'll be made in due course. She's given a commentary on, I guess, what she presumes that policy announcement will be, and I would encourage her to wait. But broadly, what we're interested in doing is increasing diversity, meeting parents' desire for choice to have a school nearby to them that actually matches the needs of their child. And we also want to see capacity built in the system in 2 ways, really. More good schools near to children where they need them. There are too many parts of our country where, in spite of all the reforms we've had and the improvements in attainment that we've seen, there are still children who can't get good enough access to a good school. But also building capacity by having some of our best schools work with other schools in the system to help collectively raise attainment and standards as a whole. And we want to see all parts of our education system, not just the school system, but universities as well, playing a stronger, better role in that. And she asked about evidence. Well, she quotes a report by the IFS that does mention issues on free school meals. But I must say I don't understand her argument. She seems to be criticising the status quo whilst resolutely defending to keep it in place.
Absolutely.
And it was really interesting listening to her because the words were really, in many respects, the voices that I heard, the voices of my childhood. You know, people having a dogmatic debate about the education system, whilst I studied in my local comprehensive entirely untouched by this ideological debate. What we want to do and what we think this Parliament and the country should do is to be prepared to look at the practical ways that we can improve attainment for our children, and to be prepared to leave no stone unturned to do that. And frankly, to complain about one aspect of our school system and then say that we shouldn't even have a debate about that element is frankly an untenable argument, and it is essentially politics and dogma coming before pupils and opportunity. It's about a prioritisation on the benches opposite, frankly, as we can see today, of an ideological debate when what we want on these benches is a debate about the practical steps we can take to tackle generational failure and schools that aren't still delivering for children who live nearby them. It would be wrong, Mr. Speaker, to discount how we can improve prospects for those children, especially the most disadvantaged, purely because of political dogma. If Labour is not willing to ask itself these difficult questions, how can it possibly come up with any of the solutions. We do believe selection can play a role. We think that there is evidence to show that it does for many children who are in grammar schools. But anyhow, we need to leave no stone unturned, Mr. Speaker. We'll be setting out our policies in due course for consultation, and I'm sure honourable members will want to debate them thoroughly after that.
Neil Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The World Economic Forum has recently reminded us that we are well down the tables in terms of literacy and numeracy. In fact, some 20% of 16 to 18-year-olds struggle with literacy, and the figure is even worse for numeracy, 25%, according to the World Economic Forum. So does the Secretary of State agree with me that it is absolutely necessary for any discussion about grammar schools not to distract us from that fundamental task that we have of improving social mobility and making sure that we make the best of use of all of the talent across the whole country and not just talk about the few?
I very strongly agree with that. And going back to the Sutton Trust report, which actually did focus particularly on free school meal children and how they performed in, for example, grammar schools, their educational gains from attaining grammar schools were actually twice as high for pupils for free school meals compared to the overall impact for pupils at grammar schools overall. But as he points out, whilst they, in their own way, provide a stretching, outstanding education for many children from all backgrounds, that helps them to have a better prospect in life. They are one part of a very broad-based school system now, a school system that has transformed out of all recognition from when grammars originally were introduced. And I think what we now need to do is look at how we can have a 21st century education policy that takes a pragmatic look of at the role of grammars. And of course, across the whole of the system, he's absolutely right that we won't lose sight of the broader reforms that we're bringing through that will improve standards across the board.
Mr. Stephen Twigg.
The Secretary of State represents a London constituency. As such, she will know that London schools have improved dramatically over the last 15 to 20 years. Does she agree with me that has happened because of focus on high standards for all children in all schools, not by going down the route of selection? Can I urge her today not to go back, not to turn the clock back to grammar schools, but to focus on high standards in all schools, in all parts of the country, for all children?
Well, I think I can absolutely reassure him. We won't be turning the clock back. He talks about London. And indeed, I think the London lessons are around collaboration, school leadership, and sharing those best practice experiences across schools. I think the challenge that I want us to discuss is how we can make sure all schools play a role in doing that, rather than simply saying that grammars are set on one side and perhaps shouldn't play as great a role across the rest of the school system. I think they should, and we want to have that debate and discussion. And fundamentally, I come back to the comments, Mr. Speaker, that I made at the beginning of this. This is about having more good school places for more children. It's about building capacity by better places and more places. It's about building capacity by sharing best practice and improving school leadership by having schools working closely together.
Helen Whately.
Both Grammar and Faversham, I'm fortunate to have an excellent grammar school in my constituency. As my right honourable friend will know, people move to Kent because of its grammar schools. Does she agree that it's not right for an excellent academic education to be only available to those who can move to the catchment areas of outstanding schools?
Well, we do need to improve diversity and improve choice. As the Prime Minister said, the reality is too often in Britain we do have selection, but it's on the basis of house prices, which is totally unacceptable in a modern Britain. We need to challenge ourselves to talk about how we can change that and improve standards for children wherever they are in our country. And simply saying that something is off the table because of political ideology and dogma does not serve the children that we want to see have an improved prospect for the future.
Barry Shearman.
Mr. Speaker, can I beg the new Secretary of State, and she's new in the job, to listen to the expertise that is out there. She might know, I chair the Advisory Council of the Sutton Trust. Listen to the Sutton Trust, because we believe in evidence-based policy. Listen to the Chief Inspector of Schools. Listen, and indeed, just look at the areas where for years we've had this kind of education, 11 plus, and what it's done to the entirety. Look at Kent in depth, and if she looks at Kent in depth, she will learn some lessons that might push her in a different direction.
Well, I think it is time that we looked at the Kent experience. I know Kent themselves have done a lot of work to really dig into the background as to how they can get more children from disadvantaged backgrounds into their grammar schools. And he's raised issues of principle. But my attitude and my response to him would be, if that's how he feels, why would he want us to discount looking at the areas of grammars to see how we can actually make them work really effectively, not just for children who get to them, but for those who don't get to them, how grammars can work more effectively with the rest of their local communities. It seems to me that the response of the Labour Party to all of those challenges is to raise them, but then simply put them on one side and ignore them. I don't think that's sensible, Mr. Speaker.
No. Mr. Philip Davis.
Mr. Speaker, Bradford is one of the worst performing education districts in the country. There is a wide provision of some outstanding results and some very, very dire results. It tends to be the case that where people can afford to buy a house in a good catchment area, they can get themselves to a school which produces outstanding results, and those who can't afford to buy a house in a good catchment area tend to get to a school with the worst results. When can people in Bradford get access, and working class people in Bradford get access to the very best grammar schools that we need? They surely should not just be a preserve of the Tory shires.
I think he speaks for many constituency MPs around this country, and the point is, people should have the choice. It shouldn't be for government to deprive them of the choice of how they want to educate their children. So this is about choice, it's about diversity, as well as building capacity in the system.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State well knows that apart from the best possible teaching, the most important thing we can do for our young people is to encourage them as they make their way through school. Given that we still as a nation are dealing with the legacy of a divided education system, why on earth does she think that subjecting more 11-year-old children to that experience of their tearful parents having opened the envelope, telling them that they have failed, is going to encourage and support them in their self-esteem and their continuing career through the education system?
Well, dare I say, Mr. Speaker, yet another Labour MP saying what's wrong with the current system, in his view, whilst also arguing we shouldn't look at it. But the legacy that I think we're interested in challenging is the one that the last Labour government left. A legacy of grade inflation, declining standards, children leaving our education system without even the basics in maths and literacy. I sat on a train last weekend and listened to a young man talk about how the fact he didn't know how to spell was holding him back at work. Now, we managed to take power from the Labour Party, but he is having to live with the consequences of an education system that fundamentally failed him every single day of his life. We inherited a university system that had a cap on the number of children that could go there. We had record numbers of young people who weren't in employment or education or training. Youth employment had gone up by 50% by the time Labour left office. What we're interested in doing is not only catching up that lost ground for our young people, but making sure beyond that that we leave no stone unturned, that we look across our entire education system to make sure that we turbocharge the prospects and the opportunities for all children in our country, but especially the most disadvantaged, and especially those that currently don't have the opportunities that they need and deserve and should have.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the government's decision to at least open this debate. It should be no part of a Conservative government's policy to actually have a statutory ban on the establishment of grammar schools. Evidence in my area where grammar schools are available just down the road in the neighbouring council area it indicates that there is widespread support for the establishment of a grammar school. Coastal communities are particularly vulnerable to poor education standards, and I hope that she will give due consideration to that if the policy goes forward. And could I also urge her to consider the possible extension of bilateral schools?
Well, I'm sure he'll be interested to see our policies when they're published shortly. But he raises some of the different elements of our secondary system that are currently there, and the desire that he has, I know, to make sure that his local community has access to better, good schools for more local children. And that's precisely what we're overall aiming to achieve.
Kate Hoey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Secretary of State is quite right not to rule out a discussion on grammar schools as part of the wide types of schools we have in this country, and I declare an interest as a product of a wonderful grammar school. But would the Secretary of State like to visit Northern Ireland, where grammar schools still exist, where they're hugely popular, where there is good education right across the spectrum, no matter what the ability of the young person is, and indeed that Northern Ireland's results continue to improve and to be better than the rest of the United Kingdom, and that there is very little private education? Perhaps she might like to go and talk to this First Minister in Northern Ireland.
I thank her for that invite, and I'm sure that I will want to take her up on that at some point shortly. And I really should emphasise to the House that, as my honourable friend said, this is an opening up of a debate that I think it is important to have for our children if we're going to rise to the challenge of looking at what it's going to take to help improve attainment and make sure that they have good schools where they're growing up. We are going to look at all these options very carefully. I recognise that this is a very emotive debate. That's because it matters, but that's also the reason why we should be prepared to have a debate about this, given how much our broader school system has now changed. So I will look very carefully at all of the arguments that are made, at all of the evidence that's produced, because I do think that's important too. But I would say to colleagues that, I'm keen to hear from colleagues across all sides of the House, and we'll be setting out all of our policy options shortly.
Lucy Allen.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's comments this morning very warmly indeed. All children have the right to fulfil their full potential. Will the Secretary of State assure this House that she is considering all methods of selection, and this is not about bringing back the 11+?
Well, we'll set out policies much more broadly, but I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that there'll be no return to the past. This is about moving forward. This is about having a 21st century approach in relation to our school system, precisely not one that's rooted in the 1960s and 1970s. I just hope the party opposite is able to engage in a modern debate rather than one that's 40 to 50 years old.
Ian Mearns.
I think that in the clamour that comes from some areas about creating new grammar schools, what many people forget is that where you create a new grammar school, de facto you also create secondary modern schools because of the skewing of the intake of those other schools. And the Chief Inspector, in his speech to London local government on Monday, accepted that grammar schools where they exist do a fine job with the intake that they have, but they have a very, very poor track record in terms of admitting youngsters from a non-middle class background. Now, if we're going to go down this road, what can the Secretary of State do to confirm that that won't be the case in other parts of the country?
Secretary of State.
I think again underlines why we're right to open up this agenda for debate. In a way, we're not going to tackle any of the issues he cares about without having a broader look at what a modern policy approach to grammars should look like. But we shouldn't just simply discount the excellent education that so many children do get at grammars, including children from very disadvantaged backgrounds. We should look harder at how we can make sure that grammars play their role more collaboratively in a wider, broader school system to make sure they build capacity and build more good places as well as they steadily improve themselves.
Lucy Fraser.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, during the course of an Education Select Committee, we heard the evidence, the truism, that what affects pupils' attainment most is good teaching in the classroom, which is evidently true. But does the Secretary of State agree with me that sometimes structures can support learning? And the PISA study of 2011 showed that giving schools autonomy improves outcomes, so that further choice for parents, for teachers and for students may give further opportunities.
Stay.
I think that's right, and critically we need to have the right level of autonomy for schools so that they can actually get on with the job of teaching our children, but also fantastic leadership in our schools. We know from the London experience that that was absolutely critical. Heads that showed what could be done in difficult schools, then working with other schools for them to put in place the same sorts of approaches, and then a teaching staff more broadly that is motivated and able to work in the classroom effectively with children who are able to be disciplined effectively by their head, and a head that genuinely feels that they have control and leadership over their school. All of these things make a difference. And of course, going beyond that, if we really are going to make an impact on long-term social mobility in Britain, which won't change overnight, we need not just schools and the education family to be driving social mobility, but we need local communities, we need business, we need our universities, we need civil society. Everybody needs to play a role alongside core education reform to make sure that children both inside the classroom but also outside are getting the skills, the knowledge, the advice and the experience that they will need to truly develop their potential.
David Brennan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. When the former Chief Inspector said that the idea that poor children will benefit from an expansion in the number of grammar schools was tosh and nonsense, was he being ideological?
Well, in opening up this debate, there will be people who have different views. But I don't believe that's a reason not to have the debate. I think it's too important. The issue of improving attainment, having more good school places for more children, of building the capacity that we need in our system for it to have great schools on the doorstep of every child in our country, is too important to simply put in a bucket that that's too hard and we might have a bit of a debate on it. I think we should have the debate, and I think we should work out what we need to do a better job of raising attainment for children who currently don't go far enough.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
I'm not an expert on the theory of secondary education, but having attended a grammar school with a largely working class contingent in the 1960s, I know something about the practice from which we all benefit. And can the Secretary of State explain to me why it's acceptable to nurture and promote sporting excellence but not academic excellence?
Well, he raises a good point around the broader issue, really, of selection, which is that all children are different, and therefore playing to those talents and those natural interests of children is important, and parents should have more choice and more diversity in the school system to be able to find not just a good school, but a good school that will be particularly good for their child.
Pat McFadden.
Mr. Speaker, the job of education in the 21st century is to maximise opportunity for the maximum number of children, whatever their background. Ofsted's Chief Inspector, Sir Michael Wilshaw, said this week that a return to grammar schools would not do that. He said it would be, and I quote, a profoundly retrograde step that would actually lead to overall standards sliding back, not improving. He said just 9% of disadvantaged children go to the grammar schools in Grammar School Bexley, whereas in non-grammar school Hackney, 62% of children go to university compared to 48% as a whole. Does she not agree that where there is failure and disadvantage, the answer should not be this festival of bring-backery, but instead a focus on expanding opportunity for all schools right across the system?
Well, essentially, expanding opportunity is at the heart of what we are doing, and I would encourage him to, rather than jump the gun, wait to see our government proposals when they are set out. But again, yet again, we've heard from the party opposite of their complaints about the current system, whilst similarly apparently maintaining a position of not wanting to have a debate on how we can improve it and make it better overall, and then ensure that that improvement is something that the entire school system can benefit from.
I realise the Right Honourable Gentleman for New Forest West may experience some teething problems as he makes his adjustment to backbench life. We look forward to hearing from the Right Honourable Gentleman on a regular basis. Unfortunately, he's no longer a minister, so he doesn't have a guaranteed slot, but an expectant nation will now hear him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm slowly readjusting myself to the metaphysical plane. I welcome what the Secretary of State has said about diversity and choice, but will she acknowledge that a grammar school might not be suited to every town? I would not relish the prospect of informing parents in Fordingbridge, Ringwood, New Milton or Lymington that their child, having not been able to get into the grammar school, would have to be bussed elsewhere.
State.
Well, I think he raises an important point about how local communities need to be intrinsically involved in how their school system locally develops, and I can assure him that we're very seized of that, and I should also take this opportunity to put on record how much I enjoyed working with him in our previous roles within the Department for Education. He did an outstanding job and was also a pleasure to have as a ministerial colleague.
Vernon Coker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Secretary of State, all of us want the best for our children. But following on from my honourable friend, the member for Gateshead, in answering his question, which in my view she didn't answer, does she not understand that the very real fear is that in reintroducing grammar schools, what you also introduce are secondary moderns? Yep. And that essentially you recreate the divisions that there has been a consensus about that we should not allow within our education system. How is it that proposing new grammar schools, which will bring secondary moderns, is going to improve attainment for all pupils in all of our communities?
I think the fundamental premise of his question is wrong. This is absolutely not about going back to the past. Secondary moderns were schools that for many, many years didn't even put their children through a single exam. Our school system is reformed, thankfully, beyond all recognition since then. So the premise of his question is wrong, and this is about improving standards for all children. He asked about how we can help make that happen. Well, one of the ways you make it happen is by having good and outstanding schools, playing more of a role, lifting other schools that can benefit from their experience and knowledge.
John Glenn.
Mr. Speaker, could I welcome the Secretary of State's focus on excellence in education for all, and invited to Salisbury to look at the mixed economy that exists with grammar schools, UTCs, a free sixth form, local authority schools and a multi-academy trust forming shortly, and also place an emphasis on the dynamics between those different types of schools and how in particular grammar schools work with their neighbours nearby to raise standards across the board. And finally, the focus on the P8 score, which does a lot to put into focus the progress made by every school, which surely needs to be where the emphasis should be placed.
He's absolutely right. Collaboration and having good schools work with a broader family to raise overall attainment is important. And secondly, he's right. We should really be looking and challenging schools on progress for every single child. Part of the problem with the sort of floor approach of getting children into GCSEs and achieving a good A-star to C grade was that it really missed out the progress that schools often make brilliantly with children that are perhaps further back in their attainment, and we should be valuing that, and that's what Progress 8 is intended to do.
I think we should hear from a philosopher, Dr. John Pugh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On a consensual note, the Minister will surely share the view the biggest and most significant problem in British education is the long tail of underperforming boys in our poorer areas, few of whom will actually pass the 11+. How on earth does she think the creation of grammar schools, in simple terms, is a solution to this?
Well, he'll be pleased to hear that the Department of Education has a range of different policies. We're allowed to have more than one to tackle poor attainment. We're going to be bringing forward some proposals on how we feel the broader school system, including grammars, can work more effectively together, and indeed the broader education system can work more effectively to raise attainment. But he's absolutely right to highlight this point of white working class boys in particular. Interestingly, there was some work that was done by the Sutton Trust that looked at primary schools that were doing a good job on improving attainment of white working class boys, and sadly there were only about 8 to 10 that really improved attainment dramatically. But what we can do now is learn from their experience and make sure that best practice is spread more effectively. But it's absolutely critical, and he's right to focus on it.
Gareth Johnson.
There's no doubt at all that there is a virtual scrum of parents around almost every grammar school in the country at the moment trying to take advantage of the excellent education and the opportunities that they provide. The answer, therefore, is not to sneer at grammar schools or to try to close them down. The option surely should be to actually enhance them. At the moment, new schools can select on the basis of children's ability at performing arts, at sport and at music, but not on their ability at maths or English. How can that be right?
Well, he's right, and the scrums around good schools aren't just around good grammars, they're around good and outstanding schools more generally, which is why our focus surely has to be on opening up the system as much as we can to make sure that we absolutely maximise our ability to get good schools and more good places for children in their local area. Many of our colleagues today have talked about how children come from miles away to the good school that's in their constituency. Well, perhaps if we already had a good school closer to where those children live, they wouldn't need to, and they wouldn't spend the time travelling and losing out on homework time and study time to do that.
Nick Dakin.
Very much welcome Comprehensive Educated Secretary of State to her place and wish her well in this new challenge. The age of 11 is too early to make final decisions which affect a child's whole future. So said Margaret Thatcher, the Secretary of State who oversaw the greatest expansion in comprehensive education. Does the current Secretary of State really want to increase the number of children taking the 11+ and bring back secondary moderns and grammar schools with a negative impact on achievement predicted by Her Majesty's Inspector and the negative impact on social mobility predicted by the government's social mobility advisor?
Well, I have a great amount of respect for the honourable gentleman, and I know that he spent a career in education before coming into this place, and I would simply say to him, as I've said to many other colleagues, to actually wait for the policy options to come out, and I'll be interested to hear his response to those in due course.
Chris Philp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I went to a state grammar school in South London, and I owe my place here to that school. Mr. Speaker, the best grammar schools actively seek children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and Wallington County Grammar, next door to Croydon, has 14% on free school meals. Would the Secretary of State support their plans to open up a satellite grammar school in my constituency, rather like the one opened up in Sevenoaks a few months ago?
Secretary of State.
I think all of us are here because of the education that we were lucky enough to have. I think the challenge that we face and that we're debating today is how we can make sure that no child misses out on that opportunity because of the postcode lottery of where they happen to have been born in our country. And we do need to ensure that good schools, whatever kind of good schools they are, have more freedom to be able to expand and to deliver more good places in our school system for children who currently don't have them.
Ben Bradshaw.
I've listened very carefully to the Secretary of State, and I haven't actually heard her explicitly support the policy announced by the Prime Minister at the backbench Conservative private meeting last night and leaked to the media. She smiles, but it's an interesting fact. But given that the Prime Minister has repeatedly boasted that she likes to take decisions thinking very carefully about them based on evidence, is she aware of any evidence that shows that a grammar school system improves attainment across the piece or improves social mobility?
Well, as I've said in the past, we haven't set out the policy proposals. They'll be set out in due course, and I would point him to research by the Sutton Trust, which clearly set out the improved attainment for free school meal children within grammar, but also actually said that in that particular piece of research they didn't see any negative impact on children outside of the grammar school system on attainment. I recognise, though, that there are different studies that have recognise different challenges around selection. But again, I would say if that's the view that honourable members take, isn't that all the more reason to open up a debate and discuss about how we can have a sensible policy on grammar schools?
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking as someone who was comprehensively educated in a comprehensive school, I saw the benefits both of academic education but also vocational education. Would my right honourable friend not agree that one of the things that we have to do in society is to assess young people, make sure that we have teaching for them that stretches them to the utmost so they achieve the best they can, and that actually assessments at all ages are important so we achieve that, so we get the best possible people in society?
He's absolutely right, and whilst we're right to really focus in on the academic attainment of children in our schools, because if they don't get those basics, they simply won't be able to succeed in any walk of life, it's also important to recognise that one of the most important things we can do alongside that is truly embed our reforms on vocational education and apprenticeships, and make sure that those are competitive routes for young people who want to actually choose a path in life that is fundamentally different from an academic one. And I think it also slightly underlines the debate that we've been having today. A slight sense actually coming, I think, sometimes from the opposition benches that actually education is purely about academic attainment. It is absolutely critical, but it's absolutely not the totality of what we need to be ensuring our children come out of an education system having gained. It has to be knowledge, but also critically skills, and we have to build those pathways on skills for children who are going to pursue a life course that is much more vocational.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State recently told the TES, "The times I learnt best were when I had great, amazing teachers who could excite me about learning," and I absolutely agree. When heads and chairs of governors in my constituency who are working really hard to raise standards and opportunities for all our young people tell me that the recruitment and retention of good teachers is the biggest challenge that they face, does she not understand the frustration that they feel that she's focused on structures where the evidence doesn't support them working, rather than the problems that they see every day in trying to deliver a fantastic education for people in Nottingham?
Well, I'd very much like to thank her for that point. I think she's absolutely right that the issues of teacher recruitment and retention and enabling and unlocking the ability for teachers to get on with their job and be excellent in the classroom is truly important. It sits alongside some of the policy options that we'll be bringing forward around selection, but it's absolutely vital, as she says, and I can assure her we're not at all losing focus on that.
Mr. Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure many across Torbay, where 3 grammar schools work perfectly well with comprehensive schools, a studio school and a very successful technical college, we've been listening to some of the comments we've had today, particularly from the Shadow Education Secretary, with some amazement. Would you agree with me that there's really nothing radical about the idea that we're going to give other areas the chance to choose to have the education system Torbay already benefits from?
For me, it's about 2 things. It's about very clearly being prepared to leave no stone unturned in asking what it's going to take to improve our education system for children. And it's about having a practical debate on that goes beyond the ideological debate and actually puts pupils first.
Kate Green.
In Trafford, where we have selection, our schools perform very well, not because of selection, but because of great teaching and good leadership. But I must tell the Secretary of State that the majority of parents in Trafford, especially parents of children with special educational needs, do not feel that they get their child into the school of their choice. In particular, they feel that the grammar schools are reluctant to take those children with special needs because they will depress the school's results. When the Secretary of State comes forward with her proposals, can she assure the House that the needs of those particularly vulnerable children will be given appropriate attention in the strategy that she proposes?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm very grateful for that question. I'd be very happy to sit down with her and further discuss this. It's an incredibly important point that we not only raise attainment across the board, but we leave no child out of that progress that we're seeing in our school improvement.
Johnny Elphick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I tell the Secretary of State that parents in Dover and Deal and Kent as a whole see grammar schools and faith-based schools as engines of opportunity and aspiration. And if the government's going to look at having new grammar schools, which I wholly support, will they also look at more faith-based schools and more skills education throughout life to give people the greatest life chances at every stage in their lives?
Stay.
I agree with him. It's about choice, it's about diversity, it's about having more choice for parents and a school system that means you can find the right school for your child that really is tailored to their needs.
Tom Blenkinsop.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary of State tell us how this helps with the government's new industrial strategy? We know that the government still has a policy of having technology colleges, which seem to have disappeared somewhat. How will grammar schools help with the new industrial strategy? But also, has the Secretary of State had any discussions with the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Church about the potential impact upon existing faith schools, particularly in the Teesside conurbation?
Secretary of State.
Well, as I've said, we will be announcing our policy options in due course, and I'm sure he'll want to respond to them. But of course, education in schools is critical for delivering on our long-term industrial strategy. If we're going to meet these dual challenges of having a successful economy, but also having our migration levels more under control. Actually, one of the ways we can do that incredibly constructively is to meet more of our skills needs from our own young people and to be training them and educating them to be able to play their role in British industry, helping our country be successful.
Mr. David Nuttall.
Mr. Speaker, does my right honourable friend agree that with all the different schools now available, if parents don't want to choose a grammar school education for their children, such schools will not survive and thrive? But we should at least give parents with limited means the same choice that better off parents have.
State.
He's absolutely right. I mean, we shouldn't accept poor school standards in whatever school they're in. I mean, we have to challenge low attainment wherever we find it, but the point I'm making to the House today is that it's not good enough to just take something off the table because of political ideology. What we need to do is challenge all aspects of our education system to play a greater role in raising attainment and building capacity.
Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There remains a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the government's thinking, which I suspect has been muddled by the ideology that they're accusing our side of the House of, and that is this. Either the school selects or the parents choose, but you cannot have selection and choice together. So does the Prime Minister's suggestion last night that she wants to see an element of selection surely indicate that the government has abandoned parental choice?
I would encourage him to wait for the policy options to be announced, and I'm sure he'll want to respond to them when they are.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Speaker. I'm sure parents in Newark will warmly welcome a new grammar school, as hundreds have to cross the border into Lincolnshire, often on very low incomes. But would the Secretary of State acknowledge what a lot our existing grammar schools are achieving on very low funding? The local grammar school for me in Gainsborough gets by on £4,000 per pupil, whilst the lowest performing school in Lincolnshire, in Lincoln, has almost £8,000. So they do provide very good value for money as well as standards.
I think he makes his point very well, and he'll be aware that we are developing our proposals on reforming the funding formula for schools, and I know that he'll want to represent his community as we do that, but it is important that we get a more equitable funding for pupils than we currently have.
Clive Efford.
Mr. Speaker, it's been a trait of this Tory government that they steal the language of the left to cover up for mean and regressive policies that they introduce using terms like social mobility, which mean quite the opposite. All the empirical evidence says that investment in early years does more to move children forwards than any form of selection at 11 could ever justify. So does she regret closing 800 Sure Start centres? And shouldn't we be investing there rather than having this pointless debate about bringing back selection?
I don't accept this either-or characterisation of policy. Actually, what we need to do is improve education at every stage of a child's life, and that is including early years as well.
What a choice. Mr. Peter Bone.
I'm not entirely sure, sir, what Northamptonshire has done to deserve the last... Anyway, could I just say to the honourable lady who speaks for the opposition and congratulate her on getting the urgent question? But I think she's under misapprehension. I know under Labour, announcements were made in the press. This government makes announcements here. And at the meeting last night, there were no new announcements of policy. And I'd be the first, sir, to object if the government started to do that. So could the Secretary of State confirm that once the policy has been decided upon, she will come to the House and report on it?
Secretary of State.
I think that was a very good choice, Mr. Speaker. And yes, I can. I can assure my honourable friend I will come and make a statement.
Mr. Philip Hollowbone.
In Kettering, where 5 of the 6 secondary schools are already academies, where we have one of the fastest house building rates in the country, and where recent exam success was very encouraging, the debate isn't, I have to tell the Secretary of State, about whether we bring back grammar schools or not. It's about having more school places. And so will she confirm to the House her support for the Conservative manifesto commitment that all good schools, whether they be maintained, academies, free or grammar, be allowed to expand?
Yes, absolutely. I think our desire is to make sure that it doesn't matter what kind of a good school it is, that it's got the chance to create those additional good places that our country needs. And then for areas that don't have good schools at all, we need to ensure we have a school system that is freed up enough so that schools can be set up there that really do improve prospects for children, or that we network those schools with other good schools nearby that are delivering. But I have to say there are some parts of our country where that's proved challenging, which is why we need to leave no stone unturned.
Tom Pursglove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that not only do different things work in different areas, but it's also absolutely essential that we have a mixture of routes by which our young people can go on to succeed? So surely it's only right that a new government is reviewing exactly where we are and looking at how best we can enhance what matters most, which is opportunity.
Secretary of State.
He's absolutely right. We've got 1.4 million more children in good or outstanding schools. We've done that a variety of ways in terms of what children are learning in the class, but also how we're getting schools to work together more collaboratively. But we now need to say, how can we take that to the next level? But also critically, for the million-plus children who still aren't getting to the attainment levels that we want and are living in parts of the country where they don't have chance to get to a good school, we have to make sure that we change the terms of trade for them in terms of their education opportunities.
Order. We come now to the 10-minute rule motion. Mr. Will Quince.
I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to make provision for statutory entitlement to leave of absence from employment for bereaved parents and for connected purposes. Mr. Speaker, I seek leave to introduce a bill to amend the Employment Rights Act 1996 to give parents who have suffered the loss of a child a statutory right to 2 weeks paid leave. May I start by paying credit to the former member for Glasgow South, who campaigned for this change, and the many honourable and right honourable members across this House who support this campaign. I know that every member of this House will agree that there can be few more distressing life events than the loss of a child. Yet with up to 5,000 children dying every year, many thousands of parents go through this personal tragedy. As the House is aware, my wife and I lost our son, who was stillborn full term, in October 2014. And I was entitled to 2 weeks off work protected by statute under the paternity rules. Now, as it happened, I had a very understanding employer, so my legal rights did not come into question. However, it was comforting to know that I was entitled to 2 weeks off work by law, that I could take the time as needed to come to terms with the incredible loss. Now, I know how valuable it was to spend precious time with my wife, coming to terms with what had just happened, registering the death, making the arrangements for the funeral, and also preparing to say goodbye. Mr. Speaker, I cannot begin to understand what it would feel like to lose a child at 7 months, 2, 5, 10, 15 years old. The grief must be unbearable, and my heart goes out to any parent that has had to go through this most terrible of life events. Yet, thinking about those very parents, why should they not have the same protection in law
as those that lose a baby through stillbirth or in the first few days and months of life. In these situations, a bereaved mother and father are entitled to full maternity and paternity leave. But if you lose a child, an older baby, nothing. Surely that cannot be right. Now, at present, there is no statutory right to take time off on compassionate or bereavement grounds. However, all employees do have the right to take immediate time off for dependents. Now, in effect, that is a legal right to take time off unpaid to deal with action that is necessary. Yet there is no set limit on how many days can be taken as leave, and a rather vague definition of a reasonable amount of time. Further, there is no statutory right to be paid during this reasonable amount of time. The reference to taking action distinguishes it from bereavement or compassionate leave. The type of action contemplated by the provision is arranging and attending a funeral, registering the death, etc., not to provide a right to leave to cope with the emotional reaction to the child's death. An employee's right, therefore, to bereavement leave is not protected by law in this respect, and so the duty to show compassion is left entirely to the employer's better judgment. Now, to be clear, Mr. Speaker, most employers are excellent. They act with compassion and kindness, offering their bereaved staff the time they need to come to terms with their loss. However, some do not. They behave in a manner which falls well short of what we would expect of them. Of course, we expect employers to act with sensitivity and flexibility like this. Yet, given the countless examples of organisations acting without sensitivity and with utter inflexibility, surely it is time for the government to act. Now, I'm certainly alive to the pressures on businesses at the moment, especially small businesses, and I am loath to introduce any additional regulatory burden. However, given the relatively and thankfully small number of bereaved parents annually, the cost to business would be small. I also believe that there is an argument that this is beneficial to business. Most employers already go out of their way to treat their staff with compassion and often pay them fully paid leave. So this change would allow them to recover some of the cost of doing so. So how much would this cost? Well, it is difficult to say because it would largely come down to the eligibility criteria. However, research conducted by the House of Commons Library suggests that the cost could be as little as £2 million per year. Now, the reality is that every bereaved parent is different. Some will want to take time off and others will want to get straight back to work. In the same way, not everyone takes their full maternity or paternity rights. The issue, however, is that they have the choice and protection by law. Now, some will come at this from a religious perspective. When a death occurs in Hinduism, for example, relatives are required to observe a 13-day mourning period after cremation. And in Judaism, family members are required to stay at home for 7 days of mourning after a death. Now, statutory bereavement is a common right across Europe and many countries across the world. Now, whilst the exact conditions vary in terms of total time off and whether said leave is paid or unpaid, it is remarkable that you can argue that Albania or Bosnia and Herzegovina have better worker rights in this area than us. My proposal would give UK workers some of the best bereavement rights in the world in terms of length of leave possible. Whilst other countries such as Israel offer leave with full salary, I believe that longer leave at a lower statutory rate is a good starting point. And, Mr. Speaker, this is a popular idea. The National Bereavement Alliance and the National Council for Palliative Care 2014 report Life After Death quoted research from ComRes which showed 81% of people agreed that there should be a legal right to receive paid bereavement leave. The government e-petition calling for bereavement leave for parents, organised by campaigner Lucy Hurd, has over 25,000 signatures, and a Change.org petition has over 165,000 signatures. The campaign also has the support of many organisations, including Child Bereavement UK, the Lullaby Trust, Working Families, Cruise Bereavement, Dying Matters. Mr. Speaker, the list goes on. I fully appreciate the concerns which the government and other members of this House may have over such a bill. It will not be perfect. There will always be sincere disagreements over the length of time given and the eligibility criteria. But let us not make the perfect the enemy of the good. This bill would be an important first step, giving thousands of bereaved parents up and down this country the opportunity to come to terms with their grief without feeling the pressure of having to return to work, and I commend the bill to the House.
Yeah. Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Johnny Mercer, Frank Field, Dr. Sarah Wollaston, Stuart Malcolm MacDonald, Suella Fernandez, Wes Streeting, James Cartledge, Greg Mulholland, Mike Wood, James Cleverly, Stella Creasy, and myself, sir.
Will Quince.
Parental Bereavement Leave Statutory Entitlement Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 28th of October, sir.
Friday the 28th of October. Thank you.